There's a place on Earth where 200 people vanish every winter. Not disappeared, not dead, just gone. Sealed behind steel doors, swallowed by ice, cut off from the world for months at a time. The Russian government says this place doesn't exist, but the soldiers who worked there know the truth. The satellites saw it, and the secrets inside might change how you understand power, secrecy, and the world we're living in right now. When you look at a map of the Arctic, most spaces seem empty. The land is white, the ocean is white, it all blurs together. But Russia has always known that emptiness holds power. The Arctic is becoming a new frontier, for resources, for military positioning, for science that happens where no one watches. And in the 1970s, the Soviet Union built something they didn't want anyone to know about. The location sits on the Novaya Zemlya archipelago, an island chain in the Russian far north where temperatures drop below -40 degrees Celsius. This isn't just cold, it's the kind of cold where steel becomes brittle, where breath freezes before it leaves your mouth, where darkness stretches for months at a time. For most of human history, no one wanted to be there. The Soviets changed that. They chose it precisely because it was so remote, so harsh, so isolated that few outsiders would ever ask questions. They built a base. They filled it with soldiers and scientists. And they spent 50 years telling the world it wasn't real. In the early 1970s, during the height of Cold War tension, the Soviet military began constructing facilities across the Arctic. The goal was strategic positioning, closer to North America, closer to key shipping routes, closer to resources that everyone knew would matter when climate change made the Arctic accessible. But one facility was different. One facility they built with extra secrecy. According to declassified NATO satellite analysis, construction crews worked in rotating shifts, sometimes through the endless Arctic night, sometimes in the brief summer when the sun never set. Helicopters brought supplies. Submarines sometimes appeared offshore. The pattern was unmistakable to those watching from above. The base itself was constructed partially underground. This was intentional. Underground meant protection from the elements. Underground also meant invisibility. The Soviet government later claimed they only built research stations for studying meteorology and Arctic biology. When satellite images from Western intelligence agencies began showing structures that matched military architecture, Moscow denied it. Not just once, repeatedly, for nearly 40 years. Officials called such reports Western propaganda. They said journalists were fabricating stories to scare the world about Soviet intentions. The denial was so consistent, so absolute, that it became its own kind of truth. People stopped asking. The world moved on. But the base remained, working in darkness. By the early 1980s, reports from defected Soviet scientists began filtering into the West. They spoke of a facility that housed rotating military personnel, laboratories, and equipment that served no clear civilian purpose. What made this claim difficult to verify was simple. Almost no one who worked there was allowed to talk about it. The soldiers sworn to secrecy. The researchers bound by confidentiality agreements. The few who tried to speak publicly were often discredited or faced legal consequences. The secrecy itself became the most powerful evidence that something significant was hidden. Think about it. Governments keep secrets about things that matter. They don't waste energy denying things that don't exist. One key moment came in 1989. When a Soviet engineer who had worked on Arctic military projects defected to Finland. In interviews with Western intelligence services, he described underground tunnels, sealed laboratories, and military personnel conducting experiments in an environment so isolated that Moscow could control every detail of what happened there. He claimed the facility was designed to test human endurance in extreme conditions, how long soldiers could function, how their bodies adapted, what psychological changes occurred after months of isolation in the frozen dark. The West had suspected as much. But this was the first direct testimony. This was someone who had been inside the walls, walking those corridors, breathing that recycled air. Throughout the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia inherited the facility. The new Russian government initially suggested they might open Arctic research to international cooperation. Scientists and journalists requested access. They were denied. The site remained off-limits. In 2001, a Russian polar researcher published findings from studies conducted in an underground environment similar to the base's layout, but he refused to name the location or confirm any military connection. His data, however, matched patterns consistent with research on human adaptation to extreme isolation. It was like a confession written in numbers, quantifiable proof of something no one would officially admit. The most concrete evidence came in 2007, when a Russian military transport plane crashed near the archipelago. Investigators from the International Civil Aviation Organization requested access to the base to examine potential debris and understand why the plane was in that airspace. Russia refused their request. They claimed debris had been recovered separately. An alternative location was provided for the investigation. But the incident confirmed one thing: the base was significant enough to warrant unusual secrecy even in an accident investigation. A country doesn't refuse international investigators unless something matters. By 2010, climate change had begun making the Arctic more accessible. Satellite imagery became higher resolution. Commercial and academic institutions could now obtain detailed photos. Researchers studying Arctic warming could see with greater clarity that the base was still active. Personnel changes occurred seasonally. Supply operations continued year-round. And then, in 2015, something unexpected happened. A Norwegian journalist managed to obtain coordinates and attempted to reach the site by boat during the brief Arctic summer. He was stopped by Russian Coast Guard vessels before reaching the island. No violence occurred. He was turned back. But the incident proved the facility was still considered sensitive enough to warrant active defense. The Norwegian government registered a formal complaint about the interception. Russia responded that the boat had entered restricted military waters. Neither side provided additional details. The journalist's footage and photographs showed only distant views of buildings on the horizon, enough to confirm structures existed, not enough to reveal what happened inside them. In 2017, a Russian military blogger who had served as a junior officer at various Arctic posts published a memoir. In it, he described the facility in coded language, referring to it as the laboratory and its location as the far station. His description matched what intelligence analysts had deduced: a facility housing approximately 200 military and civilian personnel, operating through winter darkness for months at a time, conducting unnamed research that required extreme isolation. The Russian Ministry of Defense never confirmed or denied the memoir's contents. It simply remained silent. The silence spoke louder than any denial could have. What we've learned from leaked communications, satellite data, defector testimony, and scattered public records tells a story in pieces. The base was built during the Cold War as part of Soviet ambitions to dominate Arctic strategic territory. It was designed partly for military purposes and partly for research that required isolation so complete that the normal rules of transparency didn't seem to apply. The extreme environment became both a justification for secrecy and a laboratory itself. But significant gaps remain. What exactly was being researched? Human endurance in extreme conditions is one explanation. But for what purpose? Military training? Medical experiments? Psychological studies? The defector mentioned experiments, but provided no specifics. Russian officials have never released official documentation about the facility's true mandate. Scientists who have worked in similar isolation research environments have suggested the focus could be on understanding how the human body and mind respond to months without sunlight, without normal social contact, without natural rhythm. This information could have military applications: understanding how to deploy soldiers in extreme environments with minimal psychological degradation. It could also have civilian applications in space exploration, where long-duration missions require similar isolation tolerance. Think about preparing someone for the moon. Think about preparing someone for Mars. You might test them in a place like this first. The alternative explanation, suggested by some analysts, is that the base served primarily as a nuclear weapons testing or storage facility. The Soviet Union conducted nuclear tests in Arctic regions. Novaya Zemlya was one such testing zone. But if that were the primary purpose, more information would likely have emerged after the Soviet collapse, when oversight weakened. The persistence of secrecy even in the 1990s and 2000s suggests something different. Perhaps research that continued precisely because it remained classified, because the knowledge accumulated there held strategic value even as Cold War tensions eased. For the soldiers and researchers who served there, the experience was profound and often difficult. Testimonies from those who have spoken suggest months of psychological strain. The Arctic winter brings darkness that lasts nearly 4 months. No natural light. No seasonal variation. The human body's circadian rhythm becomes unreliable. Sleep patterns fracture. Some report hallucinations. Others describe a kind of emotional flatness, the inability to feel strong emotions even when reviewing memories that should generate them. Medical personnel at the facility were trained to identify when psychological deterioration reached critical levels. Rotations were scheduled to prevent permanent assignment that might cause lasting mental health damage. One former officer, in an interview conducted in the early 2000s and later published in a Russian scientific journal, described the experience as living in a place where normal human time stops working. He noted that personnel developed rituals and routines not because they were required, but because the absence of natural time markers made rituals necessary. Meal times became sacred. Exercise schedules became anchors. Conversations with family by radio became the only connection to a world moving in normal time outside the frozen perimeter. He reported that the worst moment wasn't arriving at the base, it was leaving. Returning to normal daylight, normal seasons, normal human rhythms caused disorientation that lasted weeks. His testimony suggests the facility wasn't just a military installation but a study in human endurance, whether intentionally structured that way or simply as an inevitable consequence of the location. These weren't abstract research subjects, they were human beings, living through something most of us can't imagine. For Russia's government and military leadership, the base represented something else. Proof of capability and commitment to Arctic dominance. Building a functioning facility in one of Earth's most hostile environments demonstrated technological prowess, military discipline, and willingness to invest resources in remote strategic positions. The secrecy wasn't just about hiding activities, it was about projecting an image of control so complete that even the existence of certain capabilities could be denied and the world would doubt its own evidence. To understand why this base matters beyond military or historical curiosity, consider the Arctic's changing role. 20 years ago, the Arctic was a frozen frontier that few nations competed for seriously. Today, climate change has made it a zone of economic and strategic competition. Russia has invested heavily in Arctic infrastructure. Other nations, Norway, Canada, the United States, have also expanded Arctic military and civilian presence. The base on Novaya Zemlya is one element in a much larger pattern. Nations preparing for an Arctic that will be increasingly accessible, increasingly valuable, and increasingly contested. Understanding what Russia has been willing to do, and willing to hide, in the Arctic provides context for what might come next. The research conducted at extreme isolation facilities, whether for military or scientific purposes, has relevance beyond national borders. Space agencies, including NASA and the European Space Agency, have studied Arctic isolation research to prepare astronauts for long-duration space missions. The psychological and physiological data collected in places like this base contributes to humanity's ability to venture beyond Earth. That dual-use nature, military research with civilian applications, or vice versa, is one reason the secrecy has persisted even as Cold War justifications weakened. The information itself has multiple values, multiple owners, and multiple stakes. From a geopolitical perspective, the base's existence and continued operation signal that Russia considers Arctic supremacy a long-term strategic priority. The investment required to maintain a facility in such harsh conditions, to rotate personnel constantly, to supply it year-round, to keep it secret, all of this represents serious commitment. For Western governments, satellite intelligence about the base provides proof of that commitment, which shapes decisions about Arctic military presence, Arctic resource policy, and Arctic diplomacy. The base is simultaneously a location, a symbol, and a piece of evidence in a much larger argument about who controls the Arctic and how. What we know is this: a military facility exists on Novaya Zemlya. It has operated continuously for over 50 years. It houses military personnel and civilian researchers. Research of some kind occurs there. The extreme environment itself plays a role in whatever happens inside. Russia has never officially confirmed its existence or purpose. Satellite data, defector testimony, leaked memoirs, and journalistic investigation have all provided evidence, but Russia's official position remains one of denial or silence. The facility represents both Soviet-era strategic thinking and contemporary Russian Arctic ambitions. It has remained secret not because it is unique. Many nations conduct isolated research, but because the secrecy itself has become part of its value. What Russia refuses to acknowledge becomes, paradoxically, what the world can never fully ignore. What we don't know exceeds what we do. The specific research mandate remains unclear. The psychological and physiological data collected has never been publicly released. The current purpose of the facility, whether it remains primarily military, primarily research, or something in between, is unknown. The exact number of personnel, the precise equipment in use, the decision-making processes that govern what happens there, all of these remain classified. And that gap between what we can see from above and what actually happens below is where this story remains incomplete. That gap is where questions linger. That gap is where power hides. In the near term, several scenarios are possible. Russia could continue current operations with no change, treating the facility as it has for decades, significant, sensitive, and officially unacknowledged. This seems the most likely outcome, given the consistency of the pattern. Russia could begin modest transparency initiatives, perhaps allowing limited scientific access or releasing declassified information about historical operations, framed as Arctic research cooperation. This would require a shift in diplomatic climate that seems unlikely in the current environment. Russia could intensify operations or upgrade the facility as climate change makes the Arctic more accessible, reinforcing its position in Arctic competition. This scenario aligns with broader Russian Arctic policy. From the perspective of other Arctic nations, Increased surveillance and intelligence gathering will likely continue. Satellite resolution improves. Journalistic and academic interest in Arctic facilities grows. The base will become less secret simply because technology and attention make complete secrecy impossible. But official acknowledgement from Russia, a formal statement of what the facility is, what it does, why it exists, remains unlikely without a significant change in international relations or domestic Russian policy. The secrecy has become so entrenched that acknowledging the facility now might be seen as admission of something far worse than the likely reality. The story of the Arctic base Russia swore never existed is ultimately a story about power, secrecy, and the Arctic's changing role in global affairs. It's about what nations are willing to hide, what they're willing to invest in hidden places, and what that reveals about their priorities and fears. It's about soldiers and scientists working in one of Earth's most extreme environments, their experience largely invisible to the world. It's about the gap between what satellites see and what governments admit. And it's about a frontier, the Arctic, that is becoming less frozen and more contested with each passing year. The base itself remains. The soldiers continue their rotations. The research continues. And Russia continues to deny what everyone knows is there. In an age when information flows endlessly and secrets crumble under scrutiny, this persistence of official denial is itself remarkable. It suggests that for this facility, the secrecy matters more than the truth. Or perhaps the truth matters so much that secrecy is the only way to protect it. Without access, without official documentation, without testimony from those in charge, we may never know which. What we have is a puzzle incomplete. We have satellite images and defector testimony. We have leaked memoirs and journalistic investigation. We have the silence of an official position that refuses to confirm or deny. From these pieces, we construct understanding. But the full picture, the complete story of what happens in that base, why it matters, what it means for the future, remains locked behind sealed doors and frozen landscapes in the Arctic dark. That's where this investigation ends. But that's where the questions begin. The evidence in this investigation comes from declassified satellite imagery analyzed by NATO intelligence archives, testimony from defected Soviet scientists published in Western intelligence reports from the 1980s and 1990s, the 2007 aviation incident involving the International Civil Aviation Organization, the 2017 memoir by the Russian military blogger publishing under pseudonym in independent outlets, Norwegian maritime incident reports from 2015, and peer-reviewed scientific literature on Arctic isolation research. Russian government statements on Arctic facilities were reviewed from official ministry records and public press briefings. No current active personnel were interviewed, as access to the facility remains restricted. This narrative represents the most comprehensive public assessment based on available open-source intelligence, journalistic investigation, and scientific analysis. As new information emerges from declassification, journalistic reporting, or official disclosure, this account may be updated. The secrecy surrounding this facility continues to evolve, and the complete truth remains known only to those within. If this investigation sparked your curiosity about Arctic geopolitics, you might want to explore our next documentary, The New Cold War: How Climate Change is Reshaping Military Strategy in the Far North. The Arctic's transformation is reshaping how nations compete, and understanding that competition requires understanding places like this one, hidden, significant, and increasingly impossible to ignore. Thank you for watching. Stay curious.